no numbers, there's no pictures, there's no videos, there's no gameplay. I don't like it.
Yo, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hope you guys are doing well. Hope everyone's having a good day so far. And today, Freemers, we are back with another Free Realm Sunrise video. This time around, we are going behind the story of the Realm War. I have finally finished it. It's super long. It's got 224 pages with over 41,000 words, by the way. This took a long time to write. It's got 25 chapters, not including the prologue and the epilogue. That would be 27 if you wanted to include them. But this has been a long time coming. I've been working on this for a while, a long time, and I finished it in the dead of night, got it done, and now we're finally going to go over it, and I'm super excited to talk about this bad boy because, again, it has been a long time coming. So, man, it's crazy that we're finally here, that we finally get to talk about this thing that I've written over the past year. And to kind of just, like, before we get into it, like, the whole, like, going from, like, you know, Luck of the Draw to Sunrise Stories. And the thing about Sunrise Stories is, like, I didn't know if I was ever going to write after Luck of the Draw. I thought Luck of the Draw was going to be it. But I had a lot of different inspiration going into Sunrise Stories, and I thought, okay, well, what if there was an after everything had been, you know, said and done? Like, what if there was something after? And a lot of these stories were not only inspired from, like, art that I found in Free Realms, like in the TCG art, but also, like, inspired from people in the Free Realms community. And, you know, like, discussing that point, like, that was the whole reason I went through with Sunrise Stories, was because of all this inspiration. And then at that point, it was like, okay, well, now we have Sunrise Stories done. Like, where do we go from here? And I thought, well, what if at the end of Sunrise Stories, there was this epic conclusion to things, to wrap up the story as a whole? And that's what I intended to do with Realm War, and I have done that. I think this story has kind of a perfect wrap-up to everything. It kind of, you know, if you wanted to think that there was going to be more after this, I do have an ending that will give you an idea of what could happen. But here's the thing. I'm not going to be writing anymore after this. This is it. I'm done. Because I've had to revise a lot of stuff. I've had to fix a lot of stuff. And I'm done. I'm done with it. It's a lot of work, and I want to put my creative passions and time into other projects. As simply put, that is the situation here. So, without a further ado, this is part one of going behind the story of the Realm War, and there's something I want to add. There's going to be we're going to split this into 5 parts, so it's not super long. Like, I don't want super long form videos, but we're going to get those anyway. But yeah, man, let's get into it. Let's rip off the Band-Aid. Boom. The Realm War. And I'll go over this in separate videos, but I did actually make new graphics for each of the stories, because I thought, you know what, the book, it is a book, you can call it that. The illustrated novel, it needs a cover, a front cover, and a back cover, and I did just that. So yeah, man. So for those who don't know what the Realm War is about, I just want to bring this up. The Realm War, it leaves off after Sunrise Stories, but you will need to read both Luck of the Draw and Sunrise Stories to have context for what's going on here. Because you need context. If you read the Realm War first without reading the other two, you're crazy. Because, dude, there's so much that I pull from Luck of the Draw and put it into Realm War, and there's so much I pull from Sunrise Stories and put it into this. But the Realm War has a lot of original ideas, but like I do borrow from those stories because I wrote them. But to kind of start, let's start reading the prologue because that is what's super important here. We're going to start with the prologue, and then we're going to go through the next 5 chapters, and then we're taking a break. Okay? So let's begin. The Realm War by Kyle Freems, by yours truly. Okay? Prologue. I'm already screwing up. I'm so excited. The tale of every legend begins with a single act. Before the Realm Keepers, Sacred Grove had 2 of its very own heroes. They were like any ordinary citizen in Sacred Grove, but when it came to helping Queen Valerian, they might as well have been celebrities. The first hero strived to be great at everything he did, and wanted to become stronger on his journey. The second hero was very secretive and preferred to work alone. Fate, however, had very different plans for both of these heroes. One day in the dark forest of Briarwood, the first hero set out on a mission to rescue Valerian's baby cousin. The second hero was on the same mission and ran into the first. This sparked their alliance and led them going on countless other missions for Queen Valerian. Years had passed since then, and with the Glum invasion finally over, it seemed like fate had new plans in store for the 2 heroes. What those plans were, however, was not for fate to reveal, but for them to figure out together. So, talking about the prologue, I guess if you are keeping up with the videos, you should know where the Realm War is starting. So the Realm War is continuing off of the comics. And here's the thing, Matt. Reading the comics, it ended on a cliffhanger. And I feel like that wasn't... I feel like there's more to talk about with Dane and Maya. And that's what we're going off of here for the comics. The 2 main characters are Dane and Maya. They are the main characters. There are a bunch of characters in here. I want to point that out because I have a whole list of characters. There's more characters in the Realm War than there is in Sunrise Stories and Luck of the Draw combined. I'll say. There's a lot. But yeah, so the reason I wanted to continue off of the comics is because I wanted to include them in the final act of this trilogy, you know? I feel like Dane and Maya have more of a story to tell. I feel like they should be included in this, and I wanted to write about them. I think it's fair that I should start doing that. And I don't know, to me they're pretty interesting characters because they're only in the comics and you don't really hear much about them. And there's just a lot of lore there that I wanted to cover, kind of like what I did with Luck of the Draw. Now, one thing I want to point out, the comics take place, it's pretty unknown when they take place, but the comics take place during Luck of the Draw. So I just want to point that out because it might seem a little confusing. I think for me, the comics take place kind of right before Luck of the Draw. And then, like, the comics, the 12th issue ends when Luck of the Draw begins, if that makes sense. And the Realm War takes place after Sunrise Stories and after Luck of the Draw was said and done. But I'm very excited to tell a new story about Dane and Maya because I feel like, you know, Freedom's, it's a dead IP. And I feel like it is my responsibility to finish Dane and Maya's story because I don't think it was truly finished. I think there was more to be said about their characters than just what was in the comics. So that's what I am to do here, and I hope I did them justice, but let's keep going. Chapter 1, The Brawler. I was lost. I looked around for a light, if there was a source nearby. Instead, everywhere I turned, all I could see was darkness. I walked forward in the hopes I could find a way out. When I took my first step, the ground beneath me shined with light, and then I could see the way forward. I saw a corridor where I could see both light and darkness, like they had found balance. I tried to get close to the walls to see if I could find out where I was, But when I got close, the walls darkened. It's like someone didn't want me to look for answers. I continued down the corridor and saw more darkness than light. I couldn't tell where it led, but I was willing to push forward. When I stepped into the dark, I was lost again, with no light to guide my way. I got on both of my knees and whispered, "Give me strength." That's when I heard something open. I looked up and saw a door covered in tree branches. I hesitated for a moment, not knowing what was on the other side of the door. I was being led somewhere with very little direction, but with enough to warrant an investigation. I had questions, and beyond this door could be the answers I was looking for. I walked through the door and saw a shadowy figure sitting on a dark throne. He stared me down with a gaze I couldn't escape. I couldn't figure out who it was, but I could tell he knew me. Before I could take another step, he held out his hand and summoned dark shadow creatures to hold me in place. I was about to say something, but before I could, he exclaimed, "Kensington." And my voices are going to be a little rough here, but I'll do what I can. But so yeah, this first part right here, to put it like, you know, in perspective for all of you, it's a dream that Dane is having, and it's kind of a what's the word for it? Prophetic dream, like it's a prophecy type of dream. It's very important for the kind of whole story of the Realm War. There's a lot of like reading further in the story, you'll kind of see why I wrote this part in. And not even just like in like chapter 5 or whatever. Because I think that's when this is brought up again, but also further down in the story. But yeah, man. So it's a dream, and it plays an important role in the whole story. But yeah, let's keep going. And then all of a sudden, I woke up. It was all a dream that I thought was real. I laid in my bed thinking about what it all meant, but like all dreams, it was probably nothing. I stared at the ceiling in my apartment and wondered why I dreamt about all of those things. Light and dark, a door covered in tree branches, and a shadowy figure sitting on a throne. I knew I'd figure it all out eventually, like I always do. I heard a bark come from the kitchen and knew that it was time to get up. I walked over and saw Loki II waiting for his food. I patted him on the head and said, "You've got to learn to stop begging, boy. Even Loki I knew better than that. But if it's food you want, it's food you'll get." I filled his bowl up with the usual food I picked up in town and threw in a bone to keep him busy. Looking at him made me miss Loki I. With the way he was scarfing down his food, I never got the chance to say goodbye to him, and I wish things had turned out differently. So, for those who are confused as to why Loki I is dead, so in the comics, Dane and Maya both had pets, and what happened in Luck of the Draw was time, basically, everyone in Sacred Grove fell asleep for approximately 8 years. And what made me think of, like, I thought back to that and I was like, okay, well, there's no way, like, everyone's going to age with that. There's no way, like, the animals survived, right? And I thought about that. I'm like, okay, so I do need to, because I don't, obviously they didn't specify what the age of the animals were in the comics, but for me, I do feel like they were at least somewhat old, not like older, like they weren't like puppies or kittens, but I assume that like they were close to an older age, and I thought, well, 8 years passed, they're probably past their prime, and yeah, so I did actually, unfortunately, I killed off both Dane and Maya's pets, but I wrote about that here because I wanted there to be an explanation for it, because if I didn't bring them up, I feel like it wouldn't pair well with the comics, you know? I feel like the pets have to be there. They're not, and I just want to preface this, they're not in the entire story. They're brought up only in the beginning here, and there's a reason for that, I think, because there's too many other characters in the Realm War that it would be too much to focus on if I had their pets like constantly with them. But I mean, the comics also do that too. They completely forget about the pets existing, and they just have Dane and Maya going on adventures. But I digress. Let's keep going. Where did I leave off? Oh, right here. When the guards in Sanctuary started handing out new tech called Gleam OS, we got an announcement on the device immediately. From Valerian, she said we had all been sleeping for 8 years and had aged in the process. It explained very little and too much at the same time. When I was 12, I was trying to be a hero. I saved both Valerian and the Grove twice, but after that, I didn't know who I was supposed to be. I spent 3 years trying to find out who I was, and I distanced myself from everyone in the Grove, including Maya. Then, of course, I fell asleep for 8 years, according to Valerian. Even now, I don't really know myself, and I'm a 23-year-old adult. I feel like I've missed so much of my life, and now, more than ever, I need to find out who I really am. So, context for Dane here is, Dane has zero character development and story in the comics, and it's really sad to see because Maya has more character development than he does. And that's what I aim to fix in the Realm War from the comics is I wanted to have more character development, more story for these two characters. And that's the whole, I think that's my whole drive behind doing the Realm War is I wanted, like, I didn't really have, when I came up with the idea for the Realm War, I didn't really know what I was going to write about. And then I thought about the comics. I'm like, I could do that. I could continue that story while also creating a new story on top of it, you know? But yeah, throughout this entire story, there's going to be a lot of character building, and a lot of it is going to focus on Dane. Not for the most part, but a lot of it is, like, Dane-heavy lore, so. But anyway, let's keep going. Just when I was about to make some food for myself, my Gleam OS started ringing. I picked it up, answered the call, and asked, "Hello? Who am I speaking to?" And before we keep going here, the Gleam OS thing, it's not going to play a huge role in the story. I just was like, I need some type of, like, I think there needed to be some type of way to explain to everyone, hey, you've all been asleep for 8 years, instead of just, like, all the confusion, you know? But that was the whole reason why I included that. But anyway, let's keep going. A voice on the other end said, "This is the Royal Pixie Guard. Valerian has requested to speak with you immediately." I sighed and said, "We haven't spoken in years. I'm sure she can find someone else to help her out." He sighed and said, "There is no one else. She asked for you specifically, so don't let her down." He hung up and I was confused. I sat down on my bed and wondered what Valerian could want from me. I still remember that night when Valerian wanted to have dinner with me. As confident as I was, I never showed up for the date, and instead, I went home. I was never ready for this kind of life, and I realized I was just thrown into it. In the back of my mind, I think I felt burnt out and stressed out. But what I did that night was for the best. So, for context, at the very end of the comic book, Valerian asks Dane if he wants to go on a date. And he says, "I'll have to clear my calendar." And from that idea, I thought about it like, Dane is so confident all the time. Like, he's a one-sided character. There is not much development to him at all. He's like this one-sided dude where he doesn't really have, like... I feel like the way they wrote Dane and Maya in the comics was very rushed, and there was not a lot of character development, but, like, it's comic book. Like, you can't have a lot of character development there, but here you can. And I thought to myself, well, what if Dane never actually showed up for the date? Because, you know, he's never... The only relationship he's built is kind of with Maya, but he's never really actually had a relationship. So, I don't know. To read that all in the comics and be like, Dane, you're not actually doing much, man. Like, you're not actually... There's no way you went on a date with Valerian when you've never actually had real feelings for anyone else. You know, it's weird. It's a weird little situation, but I wanted to write about that because there's a part of me that felt like Dane was not, like, there's something about his character that didn't seem right, and I addressed that here. So anyway, let's keep going. Oh, right here. I sighed and put on my jacket, looked at Loki the second and said, "Be a good boy while I'm gone, but also remember to water the plants." He tilted his head at me and barked like I was a crazy person. Luckily for me, I lived in Sanctuary and it was just a walk uphill to see Valerian. It made me wonder why she didn't knock on my apartment door, but I always assumed she was busy being queen and all. When I arrived at the royal palace, I stood there and looked up at the world tree. It's been years since I was last here, and I didn't think I'd be coming back. And yet, here I am, wondering if I should be here. As I was about to knock on the door, I hesitated and froze. I wasn't sure if I was ready to get back into the field again, but I've been keeping to myself for far too long. Before I could knock, the door was opened by one of the guards. He smiled and said, "Queen Valerian awaits you in the Royal Auditorium, Mr. Kensington." I nodded and said, "I appreciate it, but wish me luck?" He didn't say a word, but hopefully I didn't need any luck for whatever Valerian needed from me. I walked into the Royal Hall and it still looked like the place I grew up in. I was about to reminisce when I saw Valerian waiting for me at the door. She frowned and said, "You really kept this girl waiting. I hope you have a good excuse." I shrugged and asked, "Well, I was asleep for 8 years. Maybe you could cut me some slack?" She smiled and said, "Fair enough, but you still owe me an explanation for those 3 years you avoided me." I nodded and said, "Yeah, I suppose I owe you that much. I also owe you a conversation according to your royal guards." She nodded and said, "Follow me, Dame Kensington." I followed her to a very large room, still unsure of what she needed from me. I looked around the place and something felt odd about it. I looked at Valeria and asked, "Why does this room look familiar?" She smiled and said, "This is the Royal Auditorium. It's where you spent most of your time when you were younger." I turned to her and asked, "I don't recall ever being here. Is there something you know that I don't?" She nodded and said, When you were a boy, my mother, Ayani, brought you to this theater. You had a look on your face that I will never forget, like you had witnessed the worst moment of your life and you could do nothing about it." I tried to remember what I saw, but I couldn't. I looked at her and said, "The only thing I remember from that time is being in my uncle's bakery. It wasn't really my thing, but he took care of me." She smiled and said, "That's right. My mother called your uncle to make sure you weren't alone, but you just sat in this room until he arrived." I sat down, wondering what I could have seen at such a young age. I sighed and said, "It's probably for the best that I don't try to remember what happened." She nodded and said, "Still, she never told me why you were brought here, but I'm glad you were." We both blushed, knowing that fate had brought us together. So, context here for all of this. There's a bigger story I want to tell with Dane, and I'm not going to talk about it until we get there. But, it's not really clear where Dane actually comes from. It's not really clear, like, where his story actually begins, because obviously the comics just start with Dane and Maya and Briarwood. That's it. So this is kind of some backstory that I wanted to bring in, is that Dane actually, like, he started his journey from that point in the comics in Sanctuary. Like, he lived with, Valerian's mom, Ayani, and stayed in that, in the World Tree. And his uncle, like, I'm including him in this story, but he's not heavily, you know, in the story. He's, like, in one chapter, I believe, but, yeah, but his uncle's kind of, like, the parental figure in this situation. But anyway, I just wanted to bring that up because there is a bigger story I'm trying to tell here, and Valerian plays a huge part in it, so let's keep going. She took a seat on the stage and asked, "So, Where did you run off to before your little nap? I chuckled, then leaned against a wall and said, honestly, as cliche as it sounds, I was trying to find myself. I felt lost after everything that happened, and I wanted to go on a journey of self-discovery. She looked at me and said, you really did have a good reason for bailing on our date. I'm guessing that journey was cut short when you fell asleep. I nodded and said, yeah, it was. Now I feel like I'm starting my journey all over again. It might have been for the best, considering I'm here, per your request. She smiled and said, of course, back to business as usual. As you're aware, we were all asleep for 8 years due to... She trailed off, like she didn't want to mention the reason for our slumber. She sighed and said, anyway, I need your help with a delicate situation, along with your partner that you used to work with. I shook my head and said, I haven't seen or talked to Maya in years. I'm sure I can handle whatever you need done on my own. She shook her head and said, we need her help, but more importantly, you can't do this mission alone. For my journey of self-discovery, I wasn't exactly thrilled about working with Maya again, but I didn't really have a choice in the matter. When we did team up, she never seemed thrilled about it either, even when I was. I looked up at Valeria and asked, so, what's this delicate situation you need help with? She shook her head and said, get in contact with Maya first and find her, then we can discuss the mission. I can't have you disappearing on me again. I rolled my eyes and said, oh, I'm on it, Your Highness. I left the royal palace in the hopes that I'd find Maya, wherever she was hiding, and finally get back to business as usual. So, that first chapter was all about Dane, kind of the introduction to how the story's going to start. And chapter 2 is going to be all focused on Maya, and it's kind of how I wanted to start things, kind of like, to set the tone, because in Luck of the Draw, every chapter is kind of introductions to the characters. They all have their own little chapters, and there's a chapter of like who they are before they become a hero, and that's kind of how Luck of the Draw goes. It's just like character introductions and location introductions, but here it's not going to be like that. It's only these first 2 chapters, and then from there on out, I mean, it's pretty much learning a lot. There's a lot of story here, man. A lot. We got a long way to go, so strap in, Freemers. Let's get going with chapter 2, the ninja. I'm alone again. I only had so much time with Morningstar after the slumber. At least that's what everyone in Sacred Grove is calling it. Personally, it sounds like an excuse for something that could have been avoided. But I wasn't there, so I don't know what could have been done differently to prevent it. I made my way to Blackspore to bury her. Unfortunately, 8 years of being asleep took away any time I had left with her. I wasn't really sure if I wanted to get a new cat, considering another slumber could happen at any moment. In any case, Blackspore was the best place to bury those who have moved on to the next life. So, if in the first chapter, Dane obviously, he got a new dog and named it Loki II. Now, Maya here is just burying Morningstar because, again, like, I want to think Sunrise Stories, like after all that's said and done, you move on to the Realm War, and like some of these people are just getting their, they're just getting their, what is it, their barons. What's the word for it? They're just getting their feet on the ground. They're just waking up from the whole disaster that happened, and yeah, Maya is now burying Morningstar, and Maya doesn't actually, like, I'll just tell you right now, she doesn't go and get a new cat. But there is some pretty cool story towards the very end that happens for Maya, and I won't spoil it because we're going to read about it, so, but yeah, let's keep going. Morningstar loved Blackspore as well, even more than any location in the Grove. As I approached the graveyard, I got a call on my Gleam OS. I answered the call and asked, "Hey, who is this?" I listened for a reply, and the voice said, Maya, it's Dane. We need to talk. At first, I was shocked to hear Dane's voice again, but I was also relieved. I cleared my throat and said, Dane, we haven't talked in years. Besides that, I'm really busy at the moment. He sighed and said, it's really important. Can't we just be busy together for old time's sake? He sounded like he needed me, which made total sense. I shrugged and said, fine, you can join me. I'm in Black Spore if you're serious about talking. I heard him breathe a sigh of relief and he said, I'll head down as soon as I can. It looks like we're getting the band back together. Before I could say anything, he ended the call. It's typical of Dane to end things abruptly, like our partnership, but maybe he's changed as a person. I sat down next to Morningstar's grave and waited around for Dane to show up. I'll never admit it to him, but I'm scared to be alone. It's why I came to Black Spore for Morningstar, as she was all I had left. I rested my head on my knees and closed my eyes. I heard footsteps approaching, then I looked up and saw Dane standing next to me. So, context for kind of like Maya's story is she had a lot of character development. Well, not a lot, but she had character development in the comics. And what I aim to do here, because a lot of this is going to be Dane heavy, Maya does have a little bit of character development. Like more than what was done in the comics, but I think it's important that, you know, Maya has growth in the story and that she finds, like, you know, a new side of her that she didn't know about. So that's kind of what I'm going to explore here. But anyway, I gotta drink some liquid. We're gonna be here for a hot minute. All right, let's keep going. He looked down at Morningstar's grave, then sighed and said, it's never easy losing the ones we love. I closed my eyes again and said, no, it's not. He sat down next to me and said, sometimes it's easier to move on and walk a different path. I'm not saying you should fill the void with another pet, but you should hone in on something new. I looked at him and said, I would never replace Morningstar, let alone put my focus into something that would make me forget about her. He stood up and said, when I lost Loki the First, after I woke up, I didn't know what to do. So I took a journey around the grove to see what had changed. I learned a lot and realized I had to move on with everyone around me. I looked at him and asked, so after all that, what pushed you to keep going? He sighed and said, I wanted to find myself, and because of all that time being asleep, I never got the chance. I remember getting a new dog and naming him Loki II, just as a reminder that I'm still here and I have a purpose in the grove. I've never heard him speak like that. Even when we were in danger, he would always try to make light of the situation. I was silent for a moment. Then I smiled and said, you've grown up, Dane. I'm glad you're still here. He smiled and said, I'd never leave your side, Maya. Besides, we've got a new quest from the Queen herself. I stood up and asked, how did you get roped back into her service? He shook his head and said, it's more like, how did we get roped into her service? But I'll explain on the way back to Sanctuary. I rolled my eyes and realized, in some way, the old Dane was still in there. We started to leave Black Spore, but before I could take another step out of the swamp, I turned back to look at Morningstar's grave. Dane looked at me and asked, are you going to be okay? I sighed and said, I don't really know, but I do know that she's in a better place. Better than Sacred Grove, at least. He seemed confused, but I knew he understood. I want to make Sacred Grove a realm worth living in, one that's free of death and destruction. If it meant setting out on another journey with Dane, then so be it. Alright, so from here on out, it's just going to be pretty basic titles, but all the titles have a meaning, have a very good meaning. But, dude, writing this took a long time. Like, it feels like it took forever, and I do think it took like a year and a half. Because I'm pretty sure I announced it last year, and it just like, yeah, it took its time, but we finally got here. So let's move on to chapter 3, Return. We arrived in Sanctuary. After a short while, it didn't take much to convince Maya to join me, even though she was still hurting. Also, narration-wise, obviously chapter 2 was Maya and chapter 1 was Dane, but Dane, for the most part, is going to be narrating all of, all of this, because he is kind of the main character, kind of like how Bryce was in Luck of the Draw. But anywho, it didn't take much to convince Maya to join me, even though she was still hurting. A part of me wanted to do this alone. The other part of me was glad that Maya was by my side again. Either way, we were stuck with each other, with no way around it. We entered the royal palace to meet with Valerian and to see what mission she had for us. Before we could even speak with her, she was talking with one of the pixie guards. I could hear the guard whisper to Valerian, and she said, "No sign of the amulet, my queen, but we'll keep searching." Valerian nodded and said, "Don't give up until it's found. We need that relic." The pixie guard quickly left the room, and we approached Valerian while she sat on her throne. She looked pleased to see us return. I turned back to look at the pixie and asked, "What was all that about?" Valerian tilted her head and said, That is not your concern, at least for now." Maya frowned and said, "I'm tired of the secrets of Sacred Grove. We deserve to know what's going on after everything that's happened." Valerian got off of her throne and said, "No, you don't. What goes on in the royal palace is on a need-to-know basis, and you do not need to know." I leaned against a pillar and asked, "Do we get to know about the delicate situation that we discussed?" Valerian looked towards me, then smiled and said, "That much I can tell you." She sat back down on her throne and said, "I'm glad you're both here. As I said before, this mission will require the two of you." I nodded and said, "Well, 2 is better than 1, as I've always said." Maya looked at me and said, "In all of our adventures, I've never heard you say that." I grinned and said, "I've at least implied it." Valerian rolled her eyes and said, "Anyways, back to the situation at hand. There's a site in Black Forest that I need you two to investigate." I looked at her and asked, "Black Forest? Isn't that an off-limits area?" Valerian shook her head and said, "You've missed quite a lot, Dane. We've taken down barriers that prevented communication and opened new ways to connect with one another." Maya turned towards me and asked, "I've never heard of Black Forest. What do you know about it?" I thought for a moment and said, "Not much. I do know that, out of every other region, it's the most difficult to traverse." Valerian nodded and said, "That is true. So I'll be offering to you two an alternate method of travel." Valerian led us to a room down below the palace. When we arrived, I looked around and saw 4 portals, which were all very different from each other. I turned to Valerian and asked, "I take it one of these portals leads us to Black Forest, but where would the other 3 take us to?" Valerian flew up to the portals and said, "This one leads straight to Lavender Coast. It's a volcanic sea filled to the brim with pirates." Maya looked at the shiny portal and asked, "What about this one?" Valerian turned to her and said, "Glimmer Deep, home of the Hobgoblins. Unless you want to smell like sewage, I'd recommend staying as far away as possible." The last portal caught my eye, like I had seen the place before. Before I could ask about it, Valerian flew in front of it and said, "That city might be a bit too much for you, Dane." I glared at her and said, "Maybe I'd like to visit. You don't know me that well." She smiled and said, "I beg to differ. I know more about you than you think." I scoffed and said, "I doubt that, but you must know the name of that city." Maya looked at the portal and said, Silver Hills. I looked at her and asked, how do you know that? She shrugged and said, when I was little, my parents told me stories about the city. I thought for a moment and asked, did they mention anything that was worth sharing? She shook her head and said, I thought they were just stories, but I didn't believe it was a real place. Valerian cleared her throat and said, if you two are finished discussing the portal, we have business to attend to. She directed us to the Black Forest portal and said, this will get you pretty close to the site that I need you to investigate. I looked at the portal and asked, so do I before I could say another word, Maya pushed me into the portal and followed in behind me. I fell flat on my face and said, Maya, that wasn't very nice. I could have died. She laughed and said, oh, relax. I was only trying to help. I frowned at her, then got up and looked around the area. I scratched my head, then shrugged and said, well, it's not seaside, but it's got some charm to it. She flew over and said, it sure does, but we're on a mission, not a world tour. I nodded and said, you're right. Let's hope we find something out here. So, little bit of context. If you haven't read Luck of the Draw, please do. I highly recommend you read it. It's very informative, but yeah, so Valerian's mission for Dane and Maya is to go back to Black Forest. There's literally no other reason other than to go. Like, she wants them to go back because she's looking for something. And there's context clues, you know, if you've read Luck of the Draw and you're reading this from like this point on, you can kind of figure out what Valerian is looking for until, you know, it's brought up. But it's I don't know. It's very important that that this part of the story is touched on because it's gonna move things forward. And when I was writing this, like when I started writing the Realm War, I really didn't know how I was gonna tell the story because I'm kind of bringing 3 different worlds together, and it's a lot. It's definitely a lot, but I was definitely inspired to write all of this. So I'm gonna drink some water because this is a lot to talk about and read at the same time. All right, let's keep going. We walked through the forest looking for anything out of the ordinary, but everything really blurred together. She turned to me and asked, what were you up to after we last teamed up? I shrugged and said, not as much as you think. I spent most of the time cooped up in my apartment. I felt lost and I was trying to find myself, but I never did. She shook her head and said, that doesn't even sound like you. I can't even imagine what that must have felt like. I looked down at the ground and said, I'm still feeling like that, but I think I'll find my way, eventually. She smiled and flew ahead of me. I stopped walking for a moment and asked, Maya, can I ask you about something? She stopped as well and said, I suppose. I paused to collect my thoughts and asked, I brushed it off when we first met, but did you ever find your family? She sighed and said, no, I didn't. To be honest, I never went looking for them. I just assumed they were gone. I sighed and said, they can't be gone, you know? When our work here is done, I'll help you find them. She tilted her head and said, really? You don't need to do that, Dane. I'll be all right on my own. I shook my head and said, I insist. It's the least I can do after I asked you to team up again. She smiled and nodded, then we continued on with the mission. So, again, when Maya brings up her family, Dane really doesn't care. Like, there isn't like a care going through his little brain about the fact that Maya lost her entire family to spore zombies. And I wanted to bring it up again because it is going to be important later in the story. But I want Dane to, I want there to be this assumption that maybe Maya's parents aren't actually dead. You know, maybe they're still somewhere, you know, but yeah, it is like, I wanted to give Dane more character development and have him actually, you know, care about certain things and instead of not. But yeah, it's just, if the comics had continued for Free Realms, I do wonder like if there would have been more character development, but it's hard to say, you know, if there would actually be more character development. But anyway, let's keep going. After walking for a while, we finally reached the site. I looked around for a sign of anything unusual and said, "Well, that's odd." She flew up to me and asked, "Odd?" I nodded and said, "Yeah, I don't know how to describe it, but the whole site is so quiet that you can hear everything that happened here." She listened for what I was hearing and said, "I don't hear anything, but I think I can feel the pain and agony of the site." I turned to her and said, "That's interesting. It seems like we have some sort of connection to the site. That might be why Valerian wanted us to come here." She shrugged and said, "Let's head down there and see what happened for ourselves. We'll probably find out more." I slid down the cliff and started heading closer to the site. She flew up right next to me and asked, "All right, what do you hear?" I listened for a moment and said, "It's hard to make out, but it sounds like a massive battle took place here." She felt the ground and said, "Anyone that fought in the battle didn't survive, Dane." I sighed and said, "It definitely looks that way, but let's see what else we can find." I surveyed the area and said, "Okay, let's split up and search the site. If either of us finds something, we'll have to shout." She nodded and said, "Okay, that sounds good. I'll let you know what I find." As soon as she flew off, I walked towards another cliff that looked ominous. I looked at the site nearby and saw what seemed like remains from the battle. Before I could give Maya a shout, she exclaimed, "Dane, you're gonna want to see this." I laughed to myself, considering I was about to say the same thing. I walked over to where Maya was and asked, "All right, what did you find?" She showed me two skeletons, lying across from one another in a decimated forest. She sighed and said, "It looks like they took each other out." I looked at the area around them and said, They also tore apart the forest in the process, but I'm sure they both had a good reason for doing so." She nodded and asked, "Did you find anything like this?" I nodded and said, "I'm pretty sure I find out why these two were fighting in the first place." I walked back over to the battlefield and Maya flew behind me. I showed her the area and she said, "This is definitely what Valerian wanted us to find." I shrugged and said she didn't really specify what we're supposed to be looking for, but I'm sure we'll know it when we see it. We searched the area and saw nothing but destruction in our path. She flew slowly and asked, "What could cause this much damage?" I thought for a moment and said, "Oh, hold on. Before we keep going, sorry, I forgot to go over this. So if you did read Luck of the Draw all the way through and you get to the very end, Dane and Maya are actually going over the very battlefield where that entire chapter 18, 17, I think it was 18 fight took place. So the two skeletons that they found in the forest, like lying across from one another, that was Clancy, Clancy Blackheart and I forget who the other person is, but basically the two, the dude that the mentor or whatever, the pet trainer that got Bryce and Jess time to go and get Dark Cheat. That's who's lying there in the forest. Because they both took each other out. So yeah, there's context for that. That's why there's two skeletons laying there. But anyway, let's keep going. Whatever caused this is probably what Valerian wants us to find. We found the center of the site and saw 2 skeletons laying apart from each other. She looked at one of them and said, "Killed by her own arrow." Whatever they were dealing with didn't hold back. So this is Jessica, for those who don't know, and luck of the draw. Yeah, the whole, like, it's kind of, that's where I wanted to write this, is I wanted to write Dana Maya going back to Black Forest, and they're literally going back to where Luck of the Draw ended, which is, I think, a really cool callback. If you are fans of, if you do like Luck of the Draw, like, this is very important. I looked at the other one and said, "There's barely anything left to this guy. He suffered more than anyone else we've come across." She turned to me and asked, "How do you know that?" I shrugged and said, "I can't explain it, but just by being next to him, I can hear his heart when it used to beat. He had feelings for her." She sat next to the skeleton and said, "I can feel his pain. He lost everything and everyone, but he still kept on fighting until the very end." I sighed and said, so, again, context, that's Bryce. So obviously, like, for those who don't know, I did use some Free Realms and comic art for the Realm War, but for Luck of the Draw, Samurai Stories, and the Realm War, I am using Midjourney to get some art done so I can have imagery showing what's going on. Because text is pretty boring, but it's an illustrated novel, so I did want to kind of give you guys something to look at while you're reading. And yeah, so they found Bryce and Jess. They're both lying kind of next to each other almost, but yeah, it is very sorry, my voice is like almost giving out. Ugh. The whole thing with, like, you know, they find Bryce, and you guys are probably wondering, like, why can Dana Maya hear and feel like what happened here? And it's because of the magnitude of the fight left, like, some kind of elemental residue that, I mean, it's not mentioned here, but like, there is some type of energy from the fight that is lingering, and that's why they can hear and feel certain things. But yeah, and again, this isn't the only, I just want to point this out, this isn't the only time that the Realm Keepers are going to play a role in the story, and they're going to be brought up a lot throughout this entire whole thing, the whole book. But yeah, I just wanted to bring that up real quick because it's important to talk about that. But anywho, let's keep going. I can't imagine what that must have been like. He went through more than we did. She turned to look across the cliff and said, "They all went through more than we did. Once we get back to the Grove, I want to know what happened here, straight from Valerian." I nodded and said, "I agree, but we still haven't found what we're looking for." She sighed, looked around, and said, "Well, there isn't much left to find, Dane. Even if we did find something, I'm pretty sure this site would be enough for Valerian." Right as she said that, something bright caught my eye. I walked over to an object in the grass and said, "I think I found what Valerian wanted us to find." She flew over and asked, "What is it?" I looked at it and said, "A shard, devoid of color." Though the shard had no energy, I could still sense a lingering essence within itself. I picked up the shard and said, "All right, let's get out of here." She looked at me and asked, "Well, it's about time. Do you want me to hold on to the shard so you don't lose it?" Now, if you've been picking up the context clues, you'll know what that is. And I'm gonna say what it is right now, because if it's not obvious, like it should be, that's the Gloamstone. But it's completely like it's basically gone. It's there, but like there's nothing. It's like a shell of what it once was, in a way. But again, something here that I wrote is could still sense a lingering essence within itself. So it's not completely gone, which there's context for that that will be explained later in the story, but I did want to bring that up. All right. I laughed, then shook my head and said, "Trust me, Maya, I'm a lot more careful with this stuff than I was years ago." She laughed and said, "Okay, I trust you." So we made our way back to the portal. On the way back, she looked at me and asked, "Dane, do you mind if I ask you something?" I smiled and said, "Sure, I guess it's only fair that you ask me a question, since I asked you one as well." She sighed and said, "You asked me about my family, but you've never even talked about yours." I shrugged and said, "Well, you've never asked, but there's not much to say about them." She tilted her head and asked, "What can you tell me about your family?" I sighed and said, "I don't remember anything about them. Valerian said I was brought to the royal palace, and then my uncle took me in as his own. He's the only family I've ever had." She frowned and said, "So I remember my family, but they're gone, and you don't remember your family, but you still have someone." I sighed and said, "I suppose, but I wish I could remember. My uncle and I have never really seen eye to eye, but he was there for me when no one else was." She smiled and said, "I'm glad you had someone, Dane. I just wish I could say the same." I shook my head and said, "As long as we're paired up together, doing missions, you've got me by your side. I'm not going anywhere anytime soon." She blushed and said, "That's good to know." We finally made it to the portal, and before we stepped in, I looked back towards the field and said, "Whatever happened here cannot happen in Sacred Grove." She nodded and said, "I agree. Let's make sure it doesn't." We jumped back through the portal, and Valerian was waiting right next to the stairs. She flew over to me and asked, "Did you find it?" I nodded and said, "First things first, we deserve an explanation." Maya flew up to Valerian and asked, "What happened in there?" Valerian sighed and said, "That is not your concern. Hand over the artifact." I stepped back and said, "I'm not handing you anything until you..." She cut me off and exclaimed, "Hand over the artifact." I quickly gave her what I found, and she asked, "What did you do to it?" Maya shook her head and said, We didn't do anything." Valerian cut her off and said, "I wasn't asking you, I was asking Dane." I stood there, frozen, and said, "Nothing. I found it like that in the grass on a cliff." Valerian sighed and said, "Fine, this will do. You're both dismissed. Please, leave the palace at once." Maya shook her head and said, "Not until we get answers for what Valerian cut her off again and exclaimed, "Enough! Out of my sight!" I ran and Maya flew up the stairs, scared for our lives. When we got outside, Maya turned to me and asked, "She's never been angry with us or anyone before. What's her problem?" I scratched my head, then shrugged and said, "I don't know, but what I do know is that we deserve to find out what happened in Black Forest." Maya nodded, and we decided to continue our mission, as it was far from being over. Whatever Valerian was keeping secret wasn't going to stop us from finding out the truth. If Valerian wasn't going to tell us what happened, then someone in Sacred Grove would. It was just a matter of finding the right sources. Alright, so what's interesting is that in Luck of the Draw, I do mention that Valerian made murals of what happened in Luck of the Draw, and it's what's interesting is I didn't write. Valerian wasn't a main character in Luck of the Draw. She was there, but she wasn't really a main character. And I want to write Valerian, and you could see it in Samurai Stories. I am sort of writing Valerian not as a villain, but almost like an an anti-hero, a villain, kind of, but Valerian is, I think to me, like a huge plot point of being secretive, and I wanted to write more about that, and that's why I wrote her like that. Like, I think there's more to Valerian's character that is not explored, and I think there needs to be more that's explored. That's the whole reason why I've written it like that. But anyway, let's get into Chapter 4, Answers. We headed down to the streets of Sanctuary to see if we could find someone who knew what happened all those years ago. Maya turned to me and asked, "Do you really believe anyone around here would have the information we need?" I shrugged and said, "I'm not sure, but if Valerian knows something and she's not going to say anything, someone here has to know what happened." It wasn't long until we ran into someone who was spouting nonsense at us. He took out a gold coin and exclaimed, "The end times are coming! Spend your coin while you can!" She laughed and asked, "What makes you so sure of that?" He cleared his throat and said, "My dear, look around you. Everyone is scraping to get by, and by the looks of it, things are getting worse. I can just feel a storm coming in the wind." I tilted my head and asked, "If you know more than we do, you must be important. What is your name?" He smiled and said, "My colleagues call me Abba, but you may address me as Abacus Coin Miser, the one and only." She flew up to him and asked, "Is there anything else you know that we don't? Like an event that happened many years ago?" He thought for a moment and said, "You mean the binding? It's not something that's brought up around here, but I know a little bit about what went down back then." I smiled and said, "That's great. I'd love to hear what you have to say." He cleared his throat and said, "Years ago, darkness fell over Sacred Grove. From what I've heard, it's unclear as to what caused it, but some believe that a being with unfathomable power brought that darkness down onto us." I leaned in closer and asked, "And?" He sighed and said, "And that's all I know. Valerian named what happened the binding, and said nothing else of it to anyone." She frowned and said, "There has to be more to it than just that." He nodded and said, "Valerian had some of the royal architects construct new murals and memorial caverns when all had been said and done. You might find what you're looking for in there." I smiled and said, "Thank you, Abacus, for your time and your knowledge." He nodded and said, "Remember, both are extremely valuable and could easily go out of stock." She laughed and said, "All right, we should be going." We left Abacus to his devices and made our way for the memorial caverns. When we arrived, the entrance was closed off and guarded. I tilted my head and said, "Well, that's odd. The caverns don't usually have royal guards blocking it off." She nodded and said, "There must be something important going on, otherwise they wouldn't be here." We approached the guards and one of them said, "Halt, state your business." I cleared my throat and said, "We're here to see the murals?" He shook his head and said, "The cavern is closed and off limits until further notice." She looked at him and asked, "Why is it closed?" He sighed and said, "Valerian's orders, those said orders are on a need-to-know basis." I smiled and said, "Well, I'm pretty sure we need to know." He shook his head and said, "Unless you've gone through rigorous training, like we have, you don't. Leave the area or we'll have the guards escort you out." I took a step back and said, "No need to get hostile, we're leaving." She turned to me as we were heading back and said, "We're not really leaving, right? Because I'd like to know what the plan is." I nodded and said, "So, here's the plan. Maya, you need to commit a crime. When you do, the guards will leave their post." She looked at me funny and said, "Dane, that's illegal, and I'm pretty sure we'd end up in jail for a very long time." I laughed and said, "Who's this we you speak of? It's you who would end up in jail. I'd be as free as a bird. She rolled her eyes and said, deep down, the old Dane I remember is definitely in there. Not to worry, though. I have a better plan. Maya flew over to an unused table and threw on her chef outfit. She started cooking all kinds of food and making all kinds of drinks, practically out of thin air and what she could find around her. Also, real quick, I do want to bring up Abacus Coinmiser. He's actually a character that was mentioned in I don't know where I don't know what kind of character he is, but he's mentioned in the wiki, and I thought he was like an interesting character to like throw in for one. That's the only time he's gonna be in here. Just wanting to bring that up, but yeah. Anyway, let's keep going. Once she was done, she made a sign that read, "For all of the royal guards," and left just in time. I shook my head and said, you know, sometimes I forget you're a part-time chef. She laughed and said, and sometimes I forget you're a part-time cart driver, considering you don't drive that much anymore. I nodded and said, well, you've got a point there, but when I'm on the track, I'm a pretty good driver, if I do say so myself. Just like clockwork, most of the royal guards had noticed the spread that Maya put together and rushed over to grab a bite. She smiled and said, now, while they're distracted, let's make our way into the caverns. I nodded and we quietly snuck in. I looked around the caverns and said, it's been a while since I've been in here. She turned to me and said, first time for me. There's something haunting about this place, but there's also a comforting feeling about it. I'm happy we're here. I nodded and said, well, feel free to take in sights even though we're on a mission. Maya nodded and took her time looking at everything inside the memorial. I leaned on the rope guardrails and asked, so, what made you not want to visit this place? She sighed and said, when I lost my family, I didn't know where to turn to. One day, I made my way to Sanctuary and I told someone what happened. They put their hand on my shoulder and suggested that I should go to Memorial Caverns to find clarity. I frowned and said, so you never went? She nodded and said, until now, this place scared me in a way. I didn't want clarity. I just needed my family back. I nodded and said, we'll find them, Maya. She smiled and we started heading towards the memorials. We walked up to one of them and I immediately recognized it. I took another step closer and said, that's the Unbinding, an event that changed Sacred Grove forever. She looked at me and asked, do you know what's depicted here? I nodded and said, Valerian told me about it once. She said that a powerful artifact was used across our land that freed the people of Sacred Grove, but it also cut off the people from the rest of the realms. She looked at the mural and said, so this artifact was both a blessing and a curse. I wonder if the one she described is like the one we found in Black Forest. I shrugged and said, it could be, but we'll never know until we find the newly constructed murals. Maya flew over to a part of the caverns that I had never seen before. It's like it was made to be separated from the rest of the murals. I walked over to the room and said, well, this must be what Abacus was talking about. She nodded and said, it looks new to me, even though I've never been in the Memorial Caverns. We made our way inside and saw what looked like the new mural, but it was covered up with red cloth. Maya pulled it all off and saw a title inscribed on the top of it. I looked at it and said, this one is called The Binding. It must be the opposite of what happened during the Unbinding. She nodded and said, it shows 4 heroes on a quest to protect these shards. They protected them with their lives, but eventually someone wanted the shards for their own means. A dwarf took the shards from the 4 heroes and combined them to make an artifact of unimaginable power. This caused corruption across Sacred Grove and made everyone fall asleep for 8 years. When the heroes woke up, they took the fight to the dwarf and did everything they could to stop the corruption. In the process of trying their best, they lost each other and only one hero remained. He alone took down the dwarf, then restored peace and harmony to not only Sacred Grove, but to Glimmer Deep, Lavender Coast, Silver Hills, and Black Forest. What the heroes did will not be forgotten. I scoffed and said, clearly it was forgotten, considering it was covered up and no one in Sanctuary mentions it anymore. So, a little bit of context. Obviously, like, no one's talking about, like, what happened back then because they probably just want to forget all about it. But what's weird is, like, I do think Valerian wanted to cover it up because, yeah, they're just trying to forget the past and move on. But now anyone who asks about it is not going to get an answer. Except, obviously, Abacus told them where to look. So... But I like this idea. I liked writing about this idea that Dane and Maya are looking for answers, and they don't want to be kept in the dark about everything because obviously they were asleep. They don't know what happened, right? No one really knows what happened unless you were there. And I only wrote so many characters into Luck of the Draw that there's not a lot of people who actually know what went down, you know? So anyway, I do think that was like a pretty important thing to note is like, yeah, they're in the dark. They don't know a whole lot. So they're trying to find these answers and hopefully find out what happened. So that's kind of the beginning of the Realm War and why it's so important that they know all of this stuff. But anyway, let's keep going. My throat's killing me. That's why we're only doing 5 chapters at a time, dude. But anyway. She sighed and said, well, now we know. These heroes, whoever they were, saved us from corruption. I looked at the mural and asked, why would Valerian keep this from us? Don't you think we deserve to know? She looked at me and said, she doesn't want anyone to know, is my best guess. There's more to this than meets the eye. I looked at the first part of the mural and said, those shards. We definitely found some version of the combined artifact in Black Forest, but it looked nothing like what's depicted here. She nodded and said, whatever the remaining hero did, it made the artifact powerless. I walked over to the last part of the mural and asked, we need to find out why Valerian wanted the artifact. It has no power, but it's still dangerous in the wrong hands. So, maybe our answers are in one of these places. Maya flew over to the mural and looked at the locations. She pointed to the third land and said, Silver Hills. Valerian didn't want us going there, and she didn't tell us anything about it, except the other 3 realms. I smiled and said, you've got a point. I believe the entrance to Silver Hills is by Snow Hill. Let's get a move on. We quickly left the Memorial Caverns, and with the information we had gathered, and learned more than we expected. Whatever Valerian is planning, it can't be anything good. No matter what happens, we need to put an end to this. I won't let what happened to those heroes years ago be for nothing. Hold on, I'm going to drink some water, and then we'll keep going here, but... Oof. Okay. So yeah, Dane and Maya are going to Silver Hills because there was a person there that has the answers they need. And I thought it was super important to go over that because the fact that like there's not too much information on what happened in Luck of the Draw, obviously during the Global Invasion. There's only really in like, you know, the simplest terms, there's only one person that knows what happened. Like, there's no one else around that would know, because everyone that knew about the Glum invasion or what happened is gone. Like, they're dead. Like, there's really no one else besides who we're going to talk about in this chapter. So anyway, let's move on to chapter 5, Revelation. We made it to Snow Hill, the coldest place in Sacred Grove. Maya looked at me and asked, "Do you remember when we were last here?" I smiled and said, I do. We were invited to eat food. Then we got roped into a cook-off and we had to stop Umari from eating us. She laughed and said, "That's something I'll never forget." I nodded and said, "And now we're here to seek help from the people in Silver Hills." She sighed and said, "I hope they know something that we don't." We headed towards the center of town. Then we saw the Snow Hill tree had gifts at its base and lights were all lit up around the branches. I tilted my head and said, "It's already December? I must be losing track of time. I didn't think it was already time for snow days." She sighed and said, "It's my favorite time of year, but it can be lonely without my family around." I looked at the tree and said, "If I kept track of time, I would have spent the entire month here." She turned to me and asked, "An entire month? Why?" I smiled and said, "Since my uncle and I never saw eye to eye, this was my home during the holidays." So context there, I actually included a bit of myself into those lines that Dane said. During snow days, man, like actually during the holidays, I would spend like all my time in Free Realms in Snow Hill. Like Snow Hill, I think was my favorite location in all of Free Realms because I grew up in the north and I'm still living in the north. So yeah, I basically based like all those lines off of my experience of being in the north. But yeah, I thought I'd bring that up because I do love Snow Hill. It's probably my favorite location in the game. But anyway, let's keep going. She looked at the tree and asked, "You don't get lonely?" I shook my head and said, "The opposite, actually. Being around the people of Snow Hill has brought me closer to an actual family than I ever was with my uncle." She smiled and said, "That's beautiful, Dane. I never took you for the sappy type." I chuckled and said, "I never thought I was until I did some soul searching. I'm still searching for what makes me, me, even now." She hit me on the arm and said, "You'll find it. I believe in you, even when you don't believe in yourself." I smiled and said, "That's gonna leave a mark, but I appreciate the sentiment." We made our way to the giant mountain wall at the end of Snow Hill. I took another step closer to see the entrance and my jaw dropped. I turned to Maya and said, "You have to see this." She flew on over and said, "Wow, I remember when that wall had a crystal barrier blocking it all off." I nodded and said, "Now we finally get to see what all the fuss is about over in Silver Hills." We entered the gate and saw what looked like fields of crystal deep inside of it. Maya flew around the crystals in wonder, and I froze, just looking at all of it. She laughed and said, "Dane, this is incredible. We should have come here sooner." I shrugged and said, "We never had a way of entering this place. Otherwise, I would have done it in a heartbeat." She looked at me and asked, "How did they even take that crystal barrier down in the first place?" I shrugged and said, "Well, it couldn't have been easy. I mean, the barrier formed because of the binding. Maybe the unbinding is that, wait. Is that, hold on, did I write that right? I think I did. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Whatever. Anyway, the barrier formed because of the binding. Maybe the unbinding brought it down. She looked back at the crystals and said, "Maybe, but maybe it was something else that we don't know about." I looked ahead to the pathway and said, "If that's the case, we should find out everything we can from the people of Silver Hills." Maya nodded and we followed the crystals as they shined brightly to lead us to wherever we needed to go. As we reached the end of the pathway, we stood on a large hill overlooking a giant crystal dome. I tilted my head and asked, "That can't be where we have to go, right?" She shrugged and said, "We don't really have a choice in the matter, Dane. The path ends here and that's our only option." I sighed and said, "All right, here goes nothing." We made our way down the hill and got closer and closer to the dome. So, context here, Dane and Maya have never been to Silver Hills. So, they don't know who's here. So, they don't know elves exist. They don't know anything, bro. They know nada. But if you guys also remember, the whole dome, that's what Chugsy did. He cast a spell over his entire city, and there's just a giant dome. And yeah, it's a there's that giant dome, and obviously they've never seen it before. So all of this is going to be new to Dane and Maya. It's not Bryce and Jess. They don't know anything. Like, Dane and Maya know nothing about Silver Hills. So keep that in mind as we continue reading here. I just want to point that out. It was massive, like nothing I had ever seen in Sacred Grove before. I turned to Maya and asked, I've never seen anything like this before. Do you know who could have made it? Oh, wait, I read that wrong. Hold on. I've never seen anything like this before. Do you know who could have made it? She shook her head and said, maybe someone from Maryvale, but I honestly couldn't tell you. This looks way too advanced to be something from Sacred Grove. I nodded and said, well, whoever built it might be from here. Let's get a closer look. We made it to what looked like the entrance of the dome and stood there completely frozen. It was like nothing either of us had ever seen before in Sacred Grove. We looked near the entrance and noticed people we've never seen before. I looked at Maya and asked, do you know if they're from Sacred Grove? She shook her head and said, I've never seen people with pointy ears like that before. They must be from here. We headed towards the dome entrance, and before we could even enter, 2 guards stopped us in our tracks. One of them said, you two aren't from around here. The other one asked, are you two from Sacred Grove? I nodded and said, yeah, we're here on important business. Maya looked at one of the guards and asked, why do you have pointy ears? The guard laughed and said, I have pointy ears because I'm an elf. We're all elves here in Silver Hills. I shook my head and said, that sounds made up to me. If that was true, we would have seen you guys in Sacred Grove. The guard sighed and said, only a few of our kind were trapped in Sacred Grove because of that crystal barrier. Now, we live in the present. So enough with the past. We'd like to introduce ourselves. Okay. My name is Nienna, and this is Ithil. We protect the dome entrance. I kind of forgot who was talking. Well, obviously they hadn't been introduced yet. I looked up at the entrance and asked, protecting it from what? Alright, context here. These 2 guards are actually from Luck of the Draw. So, in case you were a little confused on who these 2 guards were, they are actual. So that art at the bottom there, that's actual Free Realms concept art. That's not anything from AI. You'll know when it's Free Realms art or comic art or whatever. Like, it's not AI. Someone, a Free Realms artist actually designed those characters. So, how to utilize them, you know? Goodness gracious. All right. Ithil shrugged and said, I've never bothered to ask, but I'm sure it's from something dangerous. Nienna looked at me and asked, so, what brings you two to Silver Hills? I turned to Maya and said, we were hoping to find some guidance. We came here because we're looking for answers. We need to know what happened throughout the realms. Nienna turned to Ithil and said, you're gonna want to talk to Chugsy. He was our Archmagus and is our representative of Silver Hills. He'd be able to answer any questions you have. Maya smiled and said, it sounds like he's the elf we need to speak to. If you wouldn't mind taking us to him, we'd appreciate it. They both nodded and led us through the dome entrance of Silver Hills. What we saw blew our minds. Silver Hills was like nothing we had ever seen before. I looked at Maya and asked, have you ever seen anything like this? She shook her head and said, no, I haven't, but the stories my parents told me perfectly describe the city. I nodded, then turned to Ithil and asked, does this Chugsy live in the city? Oh, context there. The only person that still knows about what happened during the Glum invasion and who knew the Realm Keepers was Chugsy. So, fun fact, I mean, Chugsy is literally the only one alive that knows anything about what happened in the past. So he's going to be the person that Dana Meyer are going to. And I think it's cool to bring Chugsy in as a character, because Chugsy is a main character, not a main character, but he is a character that is in every single story all the way through. And Chugsy in the Realm War, he's going to be he's going to be in this entire thing. He is going to play a huge role in the Realm War, and I think you guys are really going to enjoy the character building that I've done with Chugsy. So let's keep going. He shook his head and said, "He lives on the outskirts of the city to keep an eye on the dome. After all, he's the one who made it." Maya flew up to Nienna and asked, "Is there anything he hasn't done?" She shrugged and said, "Well, he didn't make a dome for Sacred Grove." I turned to her and asked, "He was there?" She shook her head and said, "Stuck. He was stuck there for years because of the crystal barrier." I was about to say something else, but I chose to remain silent. After a bit of a walk, we finally made it to the outskirts of the city. We saw a building, unlike most that we passed by, and I stood there in awe, while everyone else pressed on. I looked at Ithel and asked, "This is where he lives?" He nodded and said, "He sure does. I actually asked him why he lives out here, and he said he prefers being away from the city." Maya tilted her head and asked, "He likes being alone?" Nienna shook her head and said, "He's used to it. Years ago, he was banished for damaging the city. It's ironic that he would eventually create this dome to protect it." I smiled and said, "Well, I say we should finally meet him and put an end to all of the mystery." They all nodded and we approached the building. Ithel knocked on the door and a voice from behind the door asked, "What do you need? Did Luthia send me more supplies?" Ithel chuckled and said, "It's us, Chugsy. You have visitors." The door opened and I only saw what the elf was wearing, which looked completely different from what Ithel and Nienna were wearing. Chugsy looked at the guards and asked, "A human and a pixie? Who did I make mad? Who did I make mad now?" Nienna laughed and said, "You didn't make anyone mad this time, Chugsy. These two come from the grove to ask you some questions." Chugsy looked confused and said, "Really? It's not every day someone comes to me for knowledge, but I'd be happy to give you both some insight." Ithel and Nienna nodded and started walking back to the city. Chugsy looked at us and said, Well, no time like the present. Please make yourselves at home." He invited us in, and I finally got to see what his face looked like. When I looked at him, I could tell he had been through enough to want to be away from the city. He walked over to his workstation and asked, "So, what brings you two to Silver Hills?" I cleared my throat and said, "We came here because we wanted to know more about the heroes that came to this city." As he stared at his work, he thought for a moment and said, "Bryce and Jessica. What happened to them was a real shame. They didn't deserve to die." Maya flew up to Chugsy and asked, "You knew them?" He sighed and said, "Not that well, but I wish I had more time to get to know them." I sat down in one of his chairs and asked, "We want to know as much as we can about them and their journey. What can you tell us?" Chugsy stared at this holographic crystal above his study and said, "At the time, I didn't know, but they were known as the Realm Keepers. When they arrived here years ago, they helped me get my life back together. Truth be told, they're the reason this dome is over the entire city of Silver Hills." Maya looked outside of the window and asked, "They put the dome up?" He laughed and said, "No, but they kept me safe while I was making the spell for the dome." I smiled and said, "It sounds like they really made an impact here." He nodded and said, "Sadly, for all of their efforts, they didn't get to live to see what we did after it went up." Maya tilted her head and asked, "So, you only knew two of them, Bryce and Jessica. Is that wait? Did I did write that right? Yeah. Okay. I'm just making sure. So yeah, again, I don't really need to say much here other than like Chugsy is gonna give them the full backstory as much as he can. But yeah, let's keep going. So you only knew two of them, Bryce and Jessica? What about the other two heroes? He cleared his throat and said, I didn't get to meet the other two, but from what I saw, it seemed like one of them was corrupted. I thought for a moment and asked, what do you mean by corrupted? He pulled up an image on his crystal and said, one of their friends appeared in these crystal fields, outside of the city. I didn't hear much, but I overheard their friend making threats and speaking in some demonic manner. Maya sighed and said, did you ever learn their names? He nodded and said, since I was curious, I asked around and got their names. Nathan and Kate. I got the names. Nathan and Cade is what they went by, but apparently they didn't survive either. I sighed and said, we read the mural in the Memorial Caverns and Sanctuary, and to at least know their names is enough for me. He smiled and said, I read it as well. They deserved better, but because of what they sacrificed, our realms are safe. Maya nodded and said, I'd still like to know more about what they were fighting for. Chugsy sighed and said, I could explain it to both of you, but only if you promise me one thing. I nodded and said, of course. He stared at both of us and said, protect the realm, just like they did. And that is where we're going to call this part of the going behind the story of the Realm War and kind of reading through it all. Thank you guys for watching. If you did, as always, I appreciate it a ton, and I will see you guys in the next video. And yeah, goodbye.